Hey everyone, welcome to episode 39 of Business Therapy, a show about helping real professionals solve real business problems. Every week, we invite guests onto the show to help guide them through the normal pains and setbacks of working through their career. Using a mindfulness first approach, we help our guests find conscious solutions and help give them the tools to take on challenges that inevitably pop up during the ups and downs of business. I'm Sam Drawshak, and as always, I'm here with Jonathan Adams. Today on the show, we're not having a guest, we're doing a Q&A session. So we've had plenty of questions stacking up as the show goes on, and we're going to take some time to address them this week in episode 39. So the first question coming onto the show is regarding last week's episode. Last week, you spoke with Grace and Eli about being okay with outgrowing their initial business relationships. What do you recommend saying to those early people who helped you get on your feet? And how do you balance new opportunities with existing relationships? So kind of a multi-part question.
And I remember the tension that Eli was feeling, specifically Eli, in that the city of Richmond really is where they started, and it seems like they feel like the city gave them a lot, and they had a lot of solid relationships with business owners in the city, and there was almost a concern to let go of any of those relationships or not tend to those relationships the way they were, even as new opportunities came and even as they were overwhelmed with all of the different directions the business could possibly take. And to that, I would say as with any relationship, you need to be very present with it and be present with where are you right now with this relationship and where are you right now with what it is doing for you. And at the end of the day, the thought about giving back is a great one. And hopefully Absurd Snacks goes on to be financially incredibly successful, and they can maybe dedicate a stadium in the city of Richmond and the like. But giving back is not necessarily part of your business when it comes to what your purpose is. So if they wanted to go ahead and focus on just the city of Richmond, and that's what made them feel good and gave the entity energy, then keep going and do it. But if they really were looking at their ultimate mission of helping as many people as possible who go down the snack aisle and have a problem with all the choices there because they have allergies that prohibit them from enjoying any of those snacks, then they might need to start making choices in the business. As I'm saying it, I remember the biopic Ray about Ray Charles, and there's a scene where the initial record label that really gave him his start could no longer. They were just too small an outfit, too small an operation to be able to propel him to the level of stardom that he was capable of achieving. And he had to end that relationship. And I don't know how different people took that scene in the movie, because it seemed like he, was not giving them a chance. But at the end of the day, he had an opportunity to affect that many more people, and he needed a label that could do that for him. So I think that's sometimes what happens in business.
Yeah, and I'll just add my thoughts to that because the way the question's structured, it's very much looking for almost a black and white. Okay, we had these relationships. Now we're growing to another stage. When is the right time to break up with them? But it's not as black and white as that. I think to what Jonathan's saying, the core is about being present with your relationships. And this is personal and professional. I'm going to dispense a broader level of thoughts on this question. Because when you're talking about balancing new relationships versus old relationships, it's not as if every relationship can only you only have enough capacity for a set number of relationships, and you have to somehow balance, as in a formula, which relationships you can have at a given time versus new ones or versus opportunities. The critical thing about having present relationships is that a relationship is built on reciprocity in the present moment. So I'll start with that as a cornerstone of the conversation, because if you think about reciprocity and what a good relationship is, it means you're giving to somebody, and there's a bond forming between you because they're also giving back. There's a mutually beneficial nature to a positive and a sustainable relationship. And it's no different with your friends, your family, your girlfriend, your spouse, between that and business relationships too, your business, another person's business, you're forming relationships that you hope are mutually beneficial to both parties. And in that has to be assessed every day. So if you have a relationship, your very first business relationship, when you're a one-person company, you can maintain that relationship if there's reciprocity when you're a million-person company and like $1 trillion business, like at the biggest scale you could possibly think of. As long as in that day, years down the road, that first relationship is still mutually beneficial to both parties, that you're still able to have an interface where you can exchange something and both parties are benefiting. And I'm saying that because that's really the guidelines and the principles that I would advise people thinking about when they think about, well, how do I balance and how do I have conversations? It's going to be the same conversation, regardless of the context, regardless of the party, whether they're one of the founding parties, whether they're a new client, which is, what are we going to do for each other today? And is there an actual realistic interface that we can create where reciprocity can be created, where mutual benefit can be created? And in some days, the answer is going to be yes. And then when you get to a certain scale, some days the answer is going to be no with certain subsets of your relationships, your business relationships. But the guidance is always the same. It's going to have to call them up and have an honest conversation about, hey, whether you've been with me from the start or whether you just joined last month or whatever, if in that moment in time, there's no longer an interface for you to trade beneficially in both ways, it's good to end the relationship, and they should see that too, or they can negotiate a way that interface can change to accommodate reciprocity. But that's all to say, it's really cutting to the heart of the question, which is there's no right or wrong about new, old, loyalty, not loyalty. It's always just about being honest about what the exchange is about, what the relationship is based on, and what the business needs in that moment in time.
And the dimension that makes it extra interesting is, what is the business? So in a relationship with two people, it's very clear what the reciprocity could be. But as a business that's comprised of multiple people, what is that consciousness of the business? What is the intention? And I think that's why it quickly gets down to purpose of the business. What brought all of you together, and what is it that's going to give all of you an equal amount of energy? And I think what happens a lot of times with startups is the initial relationships become somewhat a limitation to growth, not in terms of ending the relationship, but it's just changing the relationship. So let's say you started out with one big customer that is really dominating the direction your business is going in. That can tend to really hurt the energy of the company, because then you become your intention is really subsumed within that one big customer's intention, as an example. And in this case, where let's say it's a whole city, you might be getting down to levels of customization that actually are going to make it very, very hard to scale at some point. And so if you're conscious about it, you can go back to any of these relationships and say, hey, this has been great, but right now, either we need to raise our prices, or we can't do as much customization, or, et cetera. And that's how you make sure when you reevaluate it in that light, that's how you make sure that you don't end up so far from the energy that originally started the startup.
Yeah, and that's absolutely a critical aspect of all this, which is if you can't be honest or know who you are, and let's use as a person for personal relationships, it's very apt, but it's the same with the business, as Jonathan says, which is if you can't know what your business is or what it wants, and it like have an honest intention or an honest purpose or a clear-minded about these things, then you can't have any relationships, any positive relationships, because if you don't know what you want and you don't know your boundaries as a business, then it's going to be the same. If you're a person that doesn't know their boundaries or know what they want, they're going to have trouble forming healthy relationships. It's the very same thing. So I agree that it's absolutely critical that the first step of what do I do with my relationships is, well, what am I? What is my business? What does my business benefit from? What is it that I'm doing? And that's where the whole alignment to mission and purpose and making sure everyone in the entity is conscious and aware of what the business is super critical. I mean, it's very much like to put an analogy out there, because Jonathan's talking about, well, eventually relationships can hurt you. Like in the personal sense, let's say you grew up and your best friend for your whole upbringing wanted to stay in the town that you grew up in. And eventually you aspired to do more and you wanted to go and leave and see the world and learn different things and do different things. There comes a point in that relationship, and this happens often, where that relationship naturally comes to an end. And sometimes you don't go and talk to your friend and say, hey, so-and-so, we can't be friends anymore because I feel like this is really holding me back. it doesn't need to happen that way, but it could happen that way. But like the relationship is ending nonetheless. And the loyalty, and this could have been somebody who changed your life. But eventually in that moment in time, if your mission, your purpose is not aligned, and there's no longer any way that you can remain in contact and meet your own goals, then the relationship will fade. And such is the nature of business relationships.
And just like in the example, where I started, you can give back to that person, if you feel like you some sort of gratitude or debt or something like that. But you just have to realize when a relationship is limiting you and creating constraints. And that's the point at which either way, the relationship won't be able to sustain itself.
I think we answered that one sufficiently. You have any other thoughts on that one?
No.
So let's go on. The next one is, my co-founder and I are on different pages for the purpose of our company. We are both essential for the business to run and both want to continue to work on the business. What should we do? This is kind of a segue from what we were just talking about.
You want to start it off, Sam?
Yeah, I'll start it off. I've actually seen this in my own life many times in various companies where you think you start aligned, and then the founders, they start getting into the business, and then they have money coming in, and then the option to reinvest it, and what happens to the business next, or where does it go, or what do we do, becomes contentious. And when you talk about, oh, we have different purposes for the company, it comes back to this, well, what do we do? The first thing you have to sit down and find out if you can find an aligned purpose, especially when you are co-founders and the consciousness of the business is really the sum of let's say it's only two people and maybe just like a handful of staff. It's not like there's a right or wrong answer to what the purpose is. So if as you both go through your own evolutions as co-founders and business people, you want to take this fledgling or this young business and you want to put your energy into it and evolve in different directions, that energy is the business. There's not like the business has a purpose that you just can't figure out, or there's two different purposes that the two co-founders have. It's, you have to reach alignment, or you have to let that, if the energy is in conflict, you have to let that energy flow out of the business one way or another, because there's really no other option there. I mean, there's not a one person's going to be right and one person's going to be wrong kind of thing.
And I was going to start with where you just were, what you just mentioned, Sam, about the idea of, well, the business exists today. There is a business, so it has a purpose. There is something that's happening. So usually when co-founders start to disagree, it's because there's something that's changing in how they're thinking about something, or the business itself became just about a business. It's about, like, maybe there were some customers and now there's some revenue coming in, and now that you have one person who just wants to focus on revenue or being able to secure more customers. Another is just seeing a slow creep away from whatever the original intention was. But at the end of the day, purpose is a big one. If you have two co-founders and the very purpose why you guys exist as a business is different, then I would say that you no longer have an aligned business, or a business that's going to be able to consciously move forward. You can't have people in a rowboat, two people in a rowboat rowing in different directions. That's not going to get, nobody's going to get anywhere. And it's interesting because you could almost see how politics start in an entity. Just from these two people, you could already see that there's some kind of like different thinking and lack of transparency and lack of communication, et cetera. So I would say, number one, if you ever see that your purpose is starting to be misaligned, you need to radically increase communication and transparency between the two of you, or else say that this isn't going to work. But the second you have to curtail what you're talking about, you're done.
Yeah. And I appreciate, Jonathan, you just mentioning some other dimensions there, because I was kind of scraping more at the surface. I do think it's important to highlight what he said about when the business is operating. If you have revenue generating, the business already has sort of an inherent purpose in a way as a baseline. So I don't want anyone listening to think my answer was dismissive of the fact that, well, you've got one person and another person and they gotta have to work it out because there's no purpose otherwise. They've combined their energy and their intention. And if the company is moving and operating, there is some purpose there that's already exists. That's the consciousness of the business itself. So like Jonathan was trying to tease out, you when you're a small company, and we are assuming it's small the way the question is worded, because they're also essential to the running of the business. So we assume these are, founder operating members of the business. Your choices from a day-to-day basis are going to bend how that operating intention is going to go. So I just want to make that clear. There's almost like the business, if there's only two people in the company, there's the business that you've already started and is already moving of its own volition, and then there's you and your co-founder. So one could say that first separating those pieces and deriving, where's the business going now? What is the customer base? What is this business? And then trying to reconcile. Then we get back to where I think we originally started in this answer, which is then you have to reconcile where you're going to move the energy, because like John said, if energy is moving the business rowing one way, and then the other energy is diametrically opposed and moving the other, the business will stagnate and then it will eventually die. So like there has to be some alignment, or somebody's going to have to leave the operation. Because when we talk about the way the question frames it, we are both critical for operation. Nobody is critical for operation unless you would attest that you are the only person who can do exactly what you're doing. So if your energy is not aligned for go forward and one person needs to exit the business, it's just about finding the right replacement for that skill set to keep the business functioning. But I wouldn't paint this picture of we both have to stay in the business despite our energies being misaligned and not wanting to take the business in the same direction, because it just absolutely will not work.
And a lot of times when people think of essential, it's because maybe one's good at day-to-day operations and another's good at client relationships, or like there's different skill sets. But again, if the purposes are different, ultimately it doesn't matter. Like Sam's saying, the skill sets are replaceable. Anybody's replaceable. And the worst part about this kind of question is usually, as Sam's saying, the business has an energy all on its own, and there's real possibility and potential and opportunity there. And you don't want to stifle that. Sometimes you could even decide that you're no longer right for the business because the business is going a direction that's healthy and good, but just not what you want to be a part of. So I guess at the end of the day, co-founders need to separate themselves, or founders need to separate themselves from what a business becomes. And that's a very painful one, but very essential, because otherwise you kill something that doesn't need to be killed.
Yeah, and that I think ties together beautifully what we're trying to articulate about. It's you and your co-founder and the business, the life of the business in the room itself. So if there was going to be a tiebreaker, you have to, both co-founders have to step out of themselves a little bit and realize there's a third chair in the room, and realize that already has a direction and is already moving. So whoever's purpose is more aligned with where it's already going is more likely going to be able to take that business over successfully. And, you wouldn't want to stay in a business. If I was the co-founder that was radically opposed to the direction the business was already moving in naturally, then it would be like adopting a dog I didn't want if that co-founder ended up getting, his way. And that's really not good for the dog. It's not good for the founder. It's not good for anybody in that mix, really. So that's that part of that acknowledgement of what is the business that we built already and who has the best alignment with it, because that's most likely going to be the better configuration. And as Jonathan mentioned, having the other person having the wherewithal to say, this is not a good fit for me, you want to move the conversation in that direction. All right, let's go on to the next one. Is my company has started laying off some of my coworkers due to the recession. I'm worried about my job security. What should I do? Should I start looking for new jobs? Should I confront my boss? I'll kick it over to you to start that one off, Jonathan.
Yeah, I would say if a company is going through layoffs, the last thing your boss wants to do is deal with your stress about it as an individual, because there's something much bigger at play. If there's layoffs, the company itself is hurting. There's a problem, or presumably, if there's good, depending on the decision making, but presumably there's pain being felt. And so being sensitive to the overall pain, hey, your boss, him or herself, might be in jeopardy of losing their jobs. Like, they may not be in the best position. And this is assuming an entity that's not so conscious, because if there's layoffs or a lot of stress going on with the business and people have no sense where they stand with it, or let's say there's a merger or acquisition or any change that's occurring and people have no sense where they stand, that's a bad scenario for the business itself, because people are wasting a lot of energy, and they really should be increasing transparency in general in those scenarios. You don't want people just sitting there wondering all the time. So that's just one dimension. The other dimension is, in the question, it seems to imply that we can control this, like that there is job security actually exists, that there's some collection of things that I can accumulate, and that's going to protect me, from whatever ill can potentially happen in the future. And I think people need to let go of that illusion of security, illusion of control, and just be present and always be thinking about how they can add value in any scenario. And especially when there's crises, the person who could be most calm and collected and be thinking about how to add value and be thinking about the bigger picture and why is there layoffs, what does the company need, et cetera, that's the person that's more likely to last anyway. But it's like we talked about in relationships in the past. If you're sitting there trying to hold a relationship, that activity, that stress, and that energy that you're giving off is going to kill the very relationship that you're trying to save. And that'll do the same thing when there's a lot of stress going on in a business, and you're just sitting there trying to hold on to some position when the business itself is undergoing some sort of change. So let go of that illusion of security. Tactical things like, should I look for a job, et cetera, it depends on, like, are there payouts that are happening, and maybe this is the best thing that can happen for you. Maybe you need a vacation, who knows? But just generally being mindful and being in the present moment and not being driven by your fear is the advice I would give.
Yeah, and my advice is pretty much aligned with that. I would just say that the whole idea of confronting your boss, the word confront, is very aggressive in that. And I would say definitely agree with Jonathan to don't confront your boss and make it about you. But I would definitely encourage people, if you're nervous, to talk to your boss, try to find more information, try to find that transparency that we just mentioned, that most people should feel like you're entitled to. You should be able to know what other people know. Your manager may not know if you're going to be laid off or not. It may come down, like, he could say, no, there's absolutely no indication I'm going to lay you off, and it could come down on his desk tomorrow that you're being laid off. So like Jonathan said, there's only so much information you can get in these kind of contentious situations, especially not contentious, I mean like recession type situations, very volatile situations. So there's not going to be a, hey, I'm going to talk to my boss, which you absolutely should. But if you do, and he says, yeah, absolutely, there's so many factors to that shouldn't be you going home and be like, I don't have to prepare anything now in these volatile times. I think you should always just be present about looking for jobs. If you even have any question, or if it would make you feel better in the moment to look for other jobs, look for other jobs. I tell people all the time, there's no problem in looking for other work. You might find something you like better, regardless of your situation. So I find these things to be fairly unassociated. Do I need to look for work? Should I be worried about my job security? I guess from a conscious perspective, the answer is just no, you should never be worried about job security, because it doesn't exist. And you should always be looking for work. If you want to find new work, you have to be honest. Do you want a new job? And then the third part is always be willing to be transparent and be helpful. The last thing that Jonathan said, I'm just kind of parroting now, is if you went to your boss to talk about it and just say like, hey, I know there's a lot of tough times coming for the company. Is there anything I can do to help? Do you know anything I can do to support you? Do you have any information for me that would be relevant so that I could do a better job in this time? You don't have to go with it like, hey, am I getting fired? Help me. Because again, it's just all about how can you help others and have like a other focus, because you'll end up usually getting better results.
The part about, I'm worried about job security, it reminds me of a movie, I think it was Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks. And Tom Hanks is representing a captured Soviet spy. And a couple of times or three times during the movie, he asks him, you don't seem worried. And the spy would reply, would it help? So is there some benefit, to worrying? Is it going to help my case or something like that? If it will, I'll do it, but there's no actual purpose to worrying. And I can't stress that enough. Any minute you're spending on that is a minute that you're not actually being productive and actually probably giving off energy that's not going to help whatever case you're trying to make. So,
yeah, and I will piggyback off that by saying I personally will acknowledge that that's easier said than done.
100%.
So you have to kind of rethink, like part of becoming conscious is rethinking the way that you understand situations. And like Jonathan's saying, it's not really helpful advice to tell somebody who's worrying, well, the best way to not worry is just don't, because it can
Fair enough.
grasp your mind, and it can really contort your senses and provide and like do stress. But I mean, Jonathan is absolutely right. And I'm in the same mindset. When you ask about what should I do about being worried about my job security, the real question you're asking is, what should I do when I worry about things that
Anything.
could happen to me in the future
Yeah.
that I have no control over, which is, you could conjure any amount of horrors at any moment that can happen to you in the future. So the only difference between now is there's a context that makes your imagination a little more wild, because you have conceived of some likelihood that a negative situation is going to occur because you see it occurring to people around you. It suddenly becomes more real. But there's nothing that means you couldn't get laid off in the best market, that a meteor couldn't hit your house, that, you could die anytime you get in a car. I mean, it is this idea that for things you can't control, worry is an irrational reaction. You can assess what you know in this moment, and you can start to mitigate things that could be happening around you. But that's always going to be a combination of acquiring as much knowledge as you can to be informed, and then building an action plan based on what you know to be true in this moment in time. So, it's one of those things that you have to percolate that logic and let it filter through how you make all your decisions. And that's not something you're going to do overnight. That's part of the journey of becoming conscious. So, that's my long way to say I agree, but I agree with Jonathan, but I sympathize with you listeners who are worried out there, because it's not going to be overnight that you're going to say, oh, you're right, worrying is dumb and I just shouldn't. It's a process.
1,000%. Yeah. I mean, it's like when someone has anxiety and you just say, relax, like
Yeah.
very, very useless advice. But I would recommend anyone who is in a scenario where they're trying to think about not worrying so much to watch a clip of the movie that I just mentioned, because there's something very empowering by the stillness that the actor portrays and saying, would it help, that pokes fun at the very thought about worrying and what it accomplishes, that I have found helpful personally. So maybe more than me saying that's right.
Tom Hanks is a good teacher for a lot of things. If you're
I'm killing myself that I can't remember this actor's name because I love him. He's in a golf movie now. Darn. But he's the one who kept saying, would it help? Tom Hanks was like, aren't you worried? And
so Tom Hanks is a warrior in this situation. So
well, no, he didn't. Yeah, he just was surprised that the other guy wasn't worried. That's all.
Got it. All right. The next question we have is, what are your thoughts on the back to office action happening across the world? From a conscious business perspective and all the stats on productivity considered, it feels very counterproductive and anti-conscious. So I guess the question is, what are our thoughts on bringing people back to the office from a conscious business perspective? Well, I'll start here and saying that, like a lot of things, sweeping trends like this, like people leaving the office, people coming back to the office, it has to be contextualized. There's not going to be a single answer about, is making people come back to the office an unconscious or anti-consciousness directive, because I think it has to depend on your business and the people who are in the business and what's going on in your marketplace. But generally, I think that if I could maybe infer a little bit more of the nature of the question, I think a lot of people are unhappy, and kind of talking about the unhappiness caused by losing the freedom of remote work for some people, losing a lot of the benefits that we've learned during COVID, spending more time with your family, having more autonomy over your schedule, creating this idea that you can be remote and you can increase your productivity and still get your job done, and reducing some of the inherent micromanagement and inefficiencies of co-located working. So if you're talking about all those benefits, and would it be unconscious to lose them? Even then, again, it kind of depends. I think if you are in a straight situation where you're just saying like, hey, we have to get back to the status quo and removing everyone's benefits and all these things, I would say that's fairly unconscious, because it doesn't consider the will of your employee base. And like anything that you're making a decision that forces people to be energetically misaligned, out of flow, creates contention. I mean, there has to be an overarching logic to that would be a net win, but usually there is none. But if you're in a situation where sometimes people want to come back to business, there's some productivity argument, there's something about being co-located that people really want. It's just having an honest conversation about your business and your people. But there's nothing inherently anti-conscious about bringing people back to work is maybe my short answer to start.
I think the layer that feels not conscious is if the person making the decision that people have to come back is doing it from some sense of control, wanting to control or wanting to, have things the way they were, then that just feels not conscious because it's not based on any information. And if the person on whom this decision is being foisted and they're being told they have to come back, are they also being conscious about it? Are they being aligned or aligned with the truth of it? Is it that they feel like they're losing a benefit, or is there really a benefit to the business for you to go back into the office? And so I think that's that whole tension and those areas are where consciousness really plays a big role. But if there's data that says that being together is improves productivity, et cetera, then that's a conversation that should be had and should be surfaced.
Yeah, it's really what's best for the business is what we're saying. When you talk about conscious business, you're not talking about conscious as some nice word that just means be nice to people and give them what they want, because that's almost what it sounds like. It's really being self-aware that you are part of a living business organism and what is best for the collective. So if you're talking about that's why I think we're dancing around it, is typically things done for control and the sake of one person's control is usually not done for the collective. That is typically something that we consider unconscious. Staying home when the business is like demanding to stay home to maintain your benefits when it would actually hurt the productivity of the business overall, that's also selfish, and that would be unconscious. So a lot of times this idea of what is a conscious business, it's really having everyone in the business have a high degree of awareness of what is the business, what is best for the business, and how do we best support the business's purpose and operations. And that answer, it could be stay home, it could be come back. It's just going to depend.
What's interesting is just seeing the trend. For a while there, it seemed like companies were going to have to let people stay home because the economy was doing so well and everybody had options. And I find that as the economy gets worse, you see the businesses where there is that assertiveness of control because they're the ones who are, saying, oh, I'm not as afraid that my employees are going to leave, or maybe I even want some to leave because I want to have layoffs or something. Like I want to avoid layoffs or something. And then they're saying, come back to the business. None of it feels very conscious though, because it should really be about not the external forces that are going on, but really what's internal and what's best for the business, as Sam's saying.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times unconscious business decisions play themselves out. If you force all your staff to come back, a lot of people are saying it's not even viable because a lot of them will leave. So if that's the reality of the situation, for example, if by forcing your staff to come back, you're going to lose like 30% of them, and that really hurts the business, whoever's making that call is not making a very conscious decision, because it wouldn't help. Anything that really creates systemic unhappiness in a large portion of your staff kind of by default can't be conscious, because it means that the consensus from the people who are the business wasn't brokered before the decision was made. So if you want to say it like that, that's another way to say, well, where is this qualifier of whether it was a conscious business decision or not? Is typically people should be in alignment generally if you're talking about an entire company decision.
And yes.
Sure.
I lost my train of thought there.
So I think we're good on that. So the next one is, how do you avoid getting lost in the infinite possibilities that business leaders face?
Sorry, Sam. I just remembered my
Sure.
thought. It's just it again. If you want to be conscious about it, and you don't know what barring anything else or putting everything else aside, the key is communication. Because I think people appreciate if you explain the reasoning behind it and what needs, why you need to happen, and you have an honest conversation, as Sam's saying, that's much more helpful to just generally the entity remaining conscious than if there are these decisions by fiat and people feel like they don't know why, or that there's no benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, top down and command and control structures generally are unconscious for the same reasons Jonathan's talking about. Just you can use, I'm throwing these out there that help maybe define, because when people are like, what is a conscious business decision? If it's made by one person on behalf of the collective, it typically will be more unconscious than if they had consulted the collective. All right. The next question was, how do you avoid getting lost in the infinite possibilities that business leaders face? I think this is a nice kind of, a lot of it, when you have these Q&As, a lot of common themes show up. The short answer is presence. And we've been talking about that a lot today, and we'll continue to talk about a lot in everything that we do, because infinite possibilities only exist in the mind. The closer you get to where you are and what is going on around you in this moment in time physically, and you get out of your head, you realize that physical possibilities for you get smaller and smaller the closer you get to the present. For instance, I can only walk, if I was going to take one next step from where I'm sitting right here, I can only take, an infinite amount of steps, the radius of my leg and my foot from my body where I am right now. So like, there's a lot of variation even in that. I could step 1 inch to my left, 1 inch to my right, but the realm of possibility is not where could I go and where could I possibly see myself going, because that is truly infinite. And I could spend the rest of my life just sitting here thinking about the things I could do. So when you're trying to limit you're trying to control the sense of overwhelming analysis or conjuring of situations, the first start is, where am I now? What is my as is? Who am I? What's going on? What are the capabilities that are available in this present moment? And if you start from there always as your anchor, you can't really go that far astray.
And I find a good rule of thumb as to whether or not you're getting lost in the infinite possibilities, or in your mind, in analyzing, like, so in your example, Sam, of going one direction or another direction, like, should I go forward, backward, etc., are you not making decisions? As long as you're making decisions, as long as you're moving your feet or consciously staying firmly in place, that's okay. You're fine. But if your indecision has your foot dangling, should I go this way, and you're kind of like, hopping on one foot at some point, that's when you know that you're in analysis and analysis paralysis. I hate using these terms, but anyway, that's when you really you have a problem. And so the second I hear leaders, my first thought is, and for anyone, any decision maker, are you making decisions? And as long as you are, then it's okay that there's what you think infinite possibilities. It's really, does it play out in unhealthy choices that you're making right now?
Yeah. It's always about thinking less and doing more. And that almost sounds like it's actually one of the, I guess, foundations or principles, I think, of conscious living. What Jonathan's saying, even though, like a lot of things, it seems very counterintuitive, because it seems like, oh, well, that would be somebody who's misinformed or not putting the proper amount of diligence before they do things. But truly, if you think about the dangling foot analogy, surely it'd be better to step left and experiment whether that was the right direction, and then step back right, which you could do in the span of a minute, than to sit there for 10 minutes and consider the possibilities of going one way or another and doing nothing. And that's part of acknowledging that life is iterative, life is evolving, and that most decisions can be undone or they can be changed, but they can't be changed if they're not made. So a lot of times creating energy and creating momentum is just acting. And that balance of, well, how much do I need to think about it before I act? Some of that is experience. Some of that is just keep getting better at being in the present and knowing, okay, here's always the 80% of the facts that I'm going to have, and just making a decision based on that and listening for the outcome. Yeah, but generally limiting your choices and making sure you're prioritizing action over inaction is always going to get you a better result.
And I'll just reiterate, though, that standing in place is a decision. That's okay, because too many businesses that I see, they're running, they're not, their problem isn't that they're going 1 foot or the left, they're just running in random directions and then going in circles. So there really isn't a problem necessarily of consciously standing in place. It's just the indecision that's a problem.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I do think it's worth reemphasizing, because choosing to stay in place and staying in place because you can't make a choice are two very, very different. So learn to differentiate the difference.
Yeah. because sometimes running in a direction feels like a decision, but if it's random, it's not a decision. So
yeah. And when you meet the person, when you meet the people in your lives that they consciously choose to stay still because they think that's the best decision versus they're staying still because they're afraid, the energy of those people are extremely different. And like you should learn, even though you could look at the both people and they'd be sitting in the same place or sitting still, there's a presence there that you should learn to differentiate because it's a very important one. And I think a critical path to being a conscious person. All right. I think we have time for one more. I would say this next question is, what are the most common characteristics of people in business that you've seen overcome obstacles? That's what's the most common? Well, it's interesting because my mind was log jammed. So let me just start by explaining what I'm thinking. I see people in an unhealthy manner overcome obstacles all the time, every day. So I think the question has to be qualified a bit more, right? Because there's obstacles that are in front of people and they can surpass them. There's some people who are in some ways masochistic and they see an obstacle, and because it has shown itself, they will destroy it or they will overcome it at any odds, whether it was the right thing to do or not. And then there's people who overcome obstacles because something unknown has appeared in their path and they consciously decide to resolve it. And I want to say before those are two different types of people, even though when you zoom out, they're both overcoming obstacles on a regular basis. So I think that has to be established before I would give my answer. So maybe before I do, Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that piece? Because I think the question itself begs that clarification.
No, but I mean, I think that's the starting point.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I think the most common characteristics of people, I'm just going to focus on the people that I think overcome obstacles in a productive way, meaning that they have decided that this obstacle should be overcome, and then they endeavor to do so for healthy reasons. In those folks, the characteristics I see are people who are tend to be more adaptable. And I'm trying not to use the words that I would normally use, like around consciousness and being mindful, because it's not always the case. I think the epitome of being adaptable is being present, and then it's just kind of whatever's there is not an obstacle. It's just whatever is there. Exactly. But if you're in the mindset that this is an obstacle because I didn't expect this, and then what's the kind of person that would typically tackle it in the right way? Well, I would say people are just generally healthier people who can persevere through things that are challenging. It's kind of a broad question. I think it's what you would expect from my perspective, which is people who have a healthy disposition. They're not crushed or brought to a level of crippling stress or paralysis because something doesn't go the way they want to. I think it's people who are healthy, of sound mind, and generally have an objective and can weigh what's in front of them with objectivity and decide whether what has come into their path is something that they can process and move through. And I don't know if that's exactly maybe what the listener was hoping for, but I think that's my answer.
And I think I'll say similar things, but generally the people that seem to get past obstacles the most are people that don't see things as obstacles one way or the other. It's just whatever's next. Yeah. And that is really what separates people, because most people, the only reason something seems like an obstacle, and an obstacle implies something out of the ordinary, a bigger challenge than normal, is because they're bringing the past into it. They're bringing how things were into it, or they're bringing how things might be in the future into it. But if you're just looking at the obstacle, then usually it doesn't really matter whether it's a big problem, a small problem. It's just whatever I need to deal with right now. I remember watching an interview with Tiger Woods. I forgot which championship he played, but there was a final putt that made all the difference in the world. He was either going to win or lose, and all these millions of people on TV watching him. He's, it's just such a big moment. And they said, "What was going through your head?" And he said, "Well, I saw that the putt was lying to the right a little bit, and I would have to go, etc." Like, there was no discussion of my nerves, what I was, if I didn't win this, I wouldn't get the championship. Like, it was just, what do I have right now in front of me? And that's what's in my head. And that's the difference, because every obstacle is either an opportunity or not. You really don't know. it might seem like just a terrible obstacle or just might seem bad or good, but that's because you're ascribing value to it. But at the end of the day, the what separates people is most people, they have whatever obstacle that they have, and then all the layers that they're adding on top of it, their worry, their stress, their what it means, and all the flurry of activity they do to try and hold on to whatever was before, etc. And or having a drink at the end of the day because they're so stressed about what's ever happening at work, etc. Like they add problems to the obstacle, and that becomes their big challenge. But if you just look at everything as, okay, whatever facts are in front of me, what's the next healthy choice for me to make? And that's the approach. Those are the people that they seem to be able to be very adaptable and not have a problem.
Yeah. So the real summary that we're trying to say is the kind of people who overcome obstacles don't have any obstacles because they don't see them that way, which is true. And that's what I was struggling. And Jonathan, you helped me articulate that. But the reality is what the difference between what would be considered an obstacle and the next step in your journey is purely relative and subjective in nature and to the eye of the beholder. So I think maybe for the listener who asked this question, if the question is, how do I more successfully navigate obstacles? I think the people who have the mindset that we're describing is they don't even see them as obstacles. That's how they overcome them, because they're not obstacles. They're just things that are happening, and then they process and they deal with them like they do anything else. And I think, like to Jonathan's point, if you see it as an obstacle and you start attributing a lot of negativity to them and starting to picture yourself as a victim in these situations, that's where it becomes much more trying. And you might be the kind of person that would ask for advice on how you'd handle that. But unfortunately, it comes back to, like we were saying, about how do you not worry? Just don't worry.
But it does it points to the right approach ultimately, that mindfulness really does have a very strong power about it, because it's irrelevant whether or not you have a bad set of circumstances in front of you at this moment. It's irrelevant. It's okay. It is what it is. And now what am I doing next? And that's the reality of the situation. And the more that you can get used to that reality, the less obstacles you'll find you suddenly have.
And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us for our episode 39 Q&A. As always, we appreciate you engaging with the show. If you or anyone you know would like to come on the show to talk about what's going on in your life, we'd love to have you. So keep leaving your comments, keep leaving your questions. And other than that, we'll talk to you next week.